Hey all, and welcome back to Radical Slice. This is Eric. You're joining me on my quest to recreate something like the NES Kung Fu on Pico-8 in Lua. This is going to be a slightly different episode. I should give you a heads up right at the start. It's going to be a lot of programming and Boolean algebra and stuff. So don't expect any big cool bells and whistles like graphics wise. So if you're interested in programming, sit tight, hang out, and watch this one. Otherwise, maybe you want to skip it and come back next week. But just thought I would give you the heads up right at the top. So that's it for me. Let me pass this back to previous Eric. I realized I think I want to make some changes to the way I'm doing the freeze input. So you may recall a number of episodes ago, probably by now, um, I sort of nerfed the machine gun punch and kick. So it used to be that when you held down the attack button, the player would just like attack like rapid fire, and there's no throttle on that, for lack of a better word. You could just hold the attack button down and you would just destroy everybody. Now, though, if you do that, like if I'll press and hold the attack key, just take my word for it. But yeah, even if I press and hold it, I only get one attack and I have to release it before I can do it again. Similarly, we did something for the levels where when you enter the level, because like from the previous level, you're going to be walking in one direction, and as soon as you reach the goal, the level changes to the next level, and the player is facing the opposite direction. But because generally you're still going to be holding the arrow key down, what happens is the player sort of like walks to the same direction. So let me just show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so I've just taken care of the boss, and as I walk to the left to clear the level out, you'll notice the level will change to level 2, and because I'm holding the arrow key down, my player is going to keep going to the left. Oh, so I had sort of fixed this with a freeze input thing not too long ago, but then I had to fix some other bug that was related to the same thing, and it just made things worse, or it broke that thing. So what I'm thinking of doing is just making the freeze input functionality a little bit more flexible. I want to sort of explain how I'm going to try to approach this problem, but let me just sort of explain the way Pico-8 does input and the way I'm thinking of doing the sort of frozen input functionality here. All right, and I think I've finally gotten the borders right on this paint uh, input on OBS, so hopefully you won't see any white lines or white borders. You just get the nice dark black background. So Pico-8 represents input as 6 bits, and they go like this. Okay, so the left, if you're holding down the left key, this bit will be set. If you're holding down the right key, this bit will be set, up, down, the O button, the X button, etc. And so let's say the player is holding down, let's say they're holding down left and the X button. Then the value in input when you call the Pico-8 button function would be something like this. Or not something like this. I think it would be exactly this. Um, so you get kind of like this bit field of what inputs are being held down. Now, what I'm hoping to do is to make the freeze input a little bit more flexible. Like there are times like with the machine gun punch when I want to freeze input from these guys, right? And only these guys. Maybe for example, if the player punches and they're holding down the punch key, but they're also still holding down the walk button, I want the punch to finish and I want the player to keep walking. Like that's just going to feel better, right? Than like freezing all input all the time. That feels kind of like stiff and weird. So I just want to like freeze these selectively. Similarly, like when the level change happens, maybe I don't want to freeze those. Maybe I just want to freeze like left and right. And so I want a way to just like block those inputs. So what I'm thinking of doing is using a little bit of Boolean algebra to handle this. So let's say this was the input we're getting from the player. Right? The left button on the D-pad plus the X button. But at this point in the gameplay, for whatever reason, we want to freeze. We use blue for freeze. Let's say we want to freeze this fella right here. just the left. So we want the X to get through, but we don't want the 1 to get through. So what I'm thinking we can do is just use kind of a bit mask and some Boolean algebra for this. So let's say we had some bit mask that normally was just all the bits being set like this. And if we wanted to freeze a certain value, we would just set that to 0 like that. And then we can add these two values together before we do any input processing. And so hopefully the result of this would be that the left input would disappear, but the X input would make it through and there would be no other change elsewhere. And if we do the AND here, we can see that we end up with just 0 here. So we've blocked our left. These are all 0 because 0 and 1 is 0. And then 1 and 1 results in this. So this would result in just X being set after we process our sort of pre-process our player input. So I think something like this would work. It's a little bit funky to do the Boolean algebra because I'm just going to have to set, I'm going to have some bit mask that is whatever 6 ones in is in Boolean, 2 to the 6, I guess, or 2 to the 6 minus 1. Okay, yeah, I just checked. It's 2 to the 6 minus 1. It ends up being 63. So yeah, I just have to have like some bit mask at the 63, and then if we want to block a particular value, we'll just like set a 0 flag in this bit mask somewhere to change the value of it, end it with the player input, and that'll basically filter out any inputs that we want to freeze. So I think that'll work. It's going to require some changes because when I did a quick grep of the player code, there was a whole bunch of references to freeze input, and I was like, ah. Let me just get started. I mean, the journey of 1,000 refactors starts with a single grep, I guess. Here we go. All right, and since I did promise sort of like a code-heavy episode, let me actually, I'll narrate this refactor. So here's what we're going to do. I've highlighted the occurrences of freeze input, and I'm going to just start by, in the player reset function, probably this is something we'll want to pass in as a value. Because there's different times when the player reset function gets called, right? One is when we initialize the game, in which case we don't want to set any particular value for the freeze mask. We don't want to freeze nothing. But when we restart a level, or maybe when the player dies, maybe we do want to freeze something, right? So there might be some instances of us wanting to set some value here. Currently, we're using a Boolean value for this. We're going to change that to, let's maybe make a constant. And we'll call it freeze none. And we'll set that value to what I think it's supposed to be now, which is 63. I may have this wrong. I'm going to get some wild comments if I've done my math wrong. Anyway, yeah, so we'll set this to freeze none for now, which is, oh, I'm sorry, for freeze mask. We'll set this to the value of freeze mask. And when we call this at game initialization, we'll set it to freeze none. So here in our cart initialization, when we call player reset, let's see, we're passing in the direction. What else do we need to pass to player reset here? Oh, just the level direction of the freeze mask. Okay, cool. So that works. We can set freeze none in here. Nice. Done. That's one instance done. Okay, let's look at wherever the next instance of freeze input is. All right, this is where previously I was resetting the freeze input flag, right? And so if buttons were less than 16, which should be anything except down was being pressed. Oh, sorry, any of the D-pad values, so including down. If any of those were being pressed, but the buttons weren't, then we would reset freeze input and we would kind of unblock it. I think we can do better here. Let me see if I can draw like a quick truth table for what I'm thinking of doing. So there might be a slick like way of doing this with Boolean operators, but I think it might actually be more straightforward to just do with a for loop. So let's real quick look at what I'm trying to accomplish. So if the freeze value is set to 1, which means we're not freezing, maybe that's a little counterintuitive, but we're allowing inputs to go through, then it doesn't actually matter what the button presses. If the button is 1 or 0, we just want freeze to stay as 1, right? We're allowing button presses. If freeze is 0, which means we're freezing inputs, and the button is pressed, which would be a 1, then we want to return a 0. And if freeze is 0, so we're not allowing inputs and the button is 0, that means we want to unfreeze things and set freeze back to 1. let me actually rename freeze to like allowed inputs or something like that. I think that might be better. Okay, so I renamed freeze input to allowed inputs just because the Boolean values were bothering me. Anyway, so yeah, if allowed is 1, then it doesn't matter what the button is. We want allowed to stay 1. If allowed is 0 and the button is pressed, we want allowed to stay 0, which means we're still blocking. If allowed is 0 and button is also 0, that means the button's not being pressed and we can unfreeze and re-allow the input set to 1. So I think we can just write a quick for loop to check the various inputs and see how to manipulate the allowed values. Let me write that real quick. All right, so what I'm doing is just looping from 0 to 5, which should cover all 6 button indices. And I'm checking the allowed inputs value by ANDing it with a 1 at that position. And what that's going to do is tell me if that particular input value is being blocked right now. So if this is true, if this ends up being true, right, which means that the value on the left there is valuing to 0, that means the input is not currently allowed. So the next thing we need to check is if the button's being pressed. Straightforward, right? And if the button's not being pressed, that means we can unfreeze it. We can allow it again. So down here, what I'm doing is just ORing it by shifting a 1 to that position, and that will sort of re-allow it. So as an example, let's say we were blocking left. Or sorry, let's say we were blocking the punch button, which I think is 4. So it would look like this, right? 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 1 would be the allowed mask. Allowed inputs when we're blocking punch. So what's going to happen here is I'm going to shift 1 I places, which would be 4 places, and I'm going to AND it. Oops. Which looks like this. And if I AND these two numbers together, I'm going to get a 0, right? So that means punch is currently being blocked. Next, I'm going to check my input. If the input's being held, which means the button's being pressed, this won't execute, right? We're going to skip over this, which means it's going to stay blocked. However, if the button's not being pressed, that means the player has loyally released their grasp on the punch button. And I'm going to take allowed inputs and I'm going to shift a 1 back to that position and OR it together. So if we do the opposite, or the related operation here, we're going to OR this together. That's going to reset our mask and we'll end up with that value, right? So that will allow the punch again. So let's take a look at what this looks like in practice. This is the update stand function. So let's say the player is just kind of standing there, hanging out, and we want to be able to allow them to push a button, a punch button, hypothetically, but only press it once, right? We're going to look for the punch button, make sure it's not blocked, and if it isn't blocked, we're going to temporarily block it, right? So what we'll do is we'll call button, we'll get the whole bit mask back, and we're going to logically AND that with the allowed inputs. If you remember, that's what we're doing before when we were looking at paint before, right? So we're doing this logical AND to see if we need to block the input, or we're just sort of like filtering the player input based on the allowed values. If when we get the filtered input, this is sort of just like a shorthand for checking if the button is pressed, or not shorthand, I guess it's a longhand. What we're doing is we're checking if the button is pressed even after we filter it, right? So if the button is pressed and it's not being filtered, the first thing we're going to do is block that input now. So the way we do that is, again, by shifting a 1 4 spots like this. So the first value that we'll have is this 0, 1, 0, 0, 0. Then this little tilde will negate this. So we're going to negate it and it'll look like this. Like that. And then we're going to AND it with the currently allowed inputs, which, let's say we're allowing everything right now. We'll AND it. And we end up with, just like we did in paint before. So this is going to effectively block the punch. We can actually see that if we look at the game here. So now this is implemented. Let me save real quick. And what we would expect to see, right now freeze is 63, which means we're allowing all inputs. However, if this works, we would expect the freeze value to change to whatever this value is in binary, 1 0 1 1 1 1. which I know because I rocket binary is 47. That's not true. I know that because I already calculated it by hand before. But yeah, so if I press the punch key and hold it down, you can see it switched to 47. Actually, let's make Pico bigger so you can see it. If I press the punch key and hold it down, it stays at 47. Now, if I release the key right now, it goes back to 63. So we have some confidence that this Boolean logic is working, and we are able now to block specific inputs. So let me finish this up by making the rest of the replacements around the allowed inputs for the kick and the crouch, blah, 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 all those things. Here we go. All right, so you didn't miss much. I just made the same change over and over again in a whole bunch of different places. But yeah, I'm just checking the button input. I'm doing a logical AND to filter it against the allowed inputs. If the button is allowed and pressed, then we turn on the filter and we do our normal state change. So the magic again is at the top here, where we are resetting our allowed inputs in this little for loop, depending on whether or not the value is being blocked and whether or not the button is being pressed. I think I'm going to leave these comments in here so I don't forget what they do next time. Now we still have the problem with the level change, and so what I think I'm going to do is walk to the end of the level and demonstrate that real quick one more time. We do still have the problem with the level change. You'll notice that right now I'm not freezing any values, and that's fine. And when I walk to the end of the level, I'll have the same problems we did before. Oh, actually, we'll get an error. Hold on a sec. The game was trying to tell me the thing that I was going to do anyway, which is we're not setting any freeze value when the player gets to the end of the level. So what we can do here is try this out. Here's the code where we're resetting the player as we load the new level. And we should be able to pass in a bit mask that will tell the game to block certain inputs. And here we just want to block left and right. So if I'm thinking right, that should look like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we'll allow button X, button 0 up and down, but we'll block left and right. So we'll put zeros on the end. So that should be 60 if I've got my math right. Let me set a constant for that. And we'll call that freeze LR. Should be 60. We'll find out. We also have to update the same thing when the player dies, but probably we'll set a freeze num there. Let's just do that now before I forget. So we don't want to block anything when the player dies because there's like there's a moment for them to recover and move their hands off the controls. Here though, let's freeze LR and see if that works and reload. Okay, moment of truth. I walked to the end. I beat the boss. I promise I have not rehearsed this. Let's see if I got the value right. I'm going to walk to the left and hold the arrow key down. Hopefully freeze changes to the value 60 and the player will stop when the new level loads. Oh, 62. That was not what I wanted to see. All right, let me find where my mistake is. Hold on. So actually what I realized is my number, my addition was right. It should have been 60. I had the right value for the freeze input. But what's going on is I noticed that like for a second, the freeze value is 60 and then it would go to 62. So just for a frame. So it was being updated somehow. And what's going on is even though the value is correct, actually in the pupdate stand function. So when the player is in a standing state, I'm not actually checking the filtered input for this stuff, right? I'm only checking it for the punch and the kick, but not for the walk. And we actually want to check it here for left and right walking too. So I think if I add the filter checks here, that should probably work. And I don't want to block input here, but I do want to like make sure that it's not currently being blocked. All right, attempt number 2. Again, I have not I have not rehearsed this off camera. Let's see if it works. Hopefully freeze will stay put and yes, he doesn't move. Fantastic. Okay, so now if I let go of left, it'll set back to 63 and I should be able to walk freely again. Nice, it works. Okay, so now we can selectively lock inputs like that. That is pretty cool. Let me do that again because I'm so satisfied with it. One more time. Oh, it's so good. Okay, cool. Yeah, you can see like immediately the value goes to 62. That's because when I freeze the input, I'm freezing both left and right, but I'm only holding left when I leave the level, right? I'm not actually holding right. So immediately it unblocks the right input because it's not being held down. So that's all as we would expect it to be. All right, fantastic. I did not necessarily solve any huge problems by doing that, but it makes me feel better that now I have the flexibility to block inputs a lot more selectively. And I'm sure as soon as I post this, somebody's gonna be like, "Yo, dude, there's a Pico-8 function that just like does this for you." But okay, we if there is, we just reverse engineered it and pat on the back. Us, good job. So anyway, yeah, sorry, that was a bit of a much heavier programmy session than I normally like to do. I hope it wasn't too boring. And I don't think I'll do too many of these unless people want to see them. But yeah, there you go. Selective input blocking.